So it's the summer of 1971, and John Prine and Steve Goodman have been in New York City for about a week when they get a call from their friend Kris Kristofferson, someone who was influential in getting both of their careers off the ground. He was playing a show at the Bitter End, the famous Greenwich Village nightclub. The scene in the village at that time was still present, but it was a shadow of what it had been a decade earlier. It's hard to say what brought down the Greenwich Village folk revival, but we can say for sure that the beginning of the end came in a two-pronged attack. From one side, with the release of Bob Dylan's groundbreaking 1965 record, bringing it all back home, where he decided to plug in his guitar and create great art on a jukebox. And from the other, you had the Beatles with their blues-inspired rock music that set off a generation's worth of British invasion bands. Of course, there were those folk artists who hung on, but by the time the decade had switched over into the sprightly 70s, those key players who once called the village home had headed westward to the sunny hills of California. But Steve Goodman remembered what it was like when he lived there in the summer of 1967, where he rented a brownstone across from the Café Wa, where he became a regular performer. At the time, John Prine was in Germany serving his time in the American Army, working as a mechanic. John was one of the lucky ones, selected for the draft at the height of the Vietnam War, but whose duty consisted of vehicle maintenance in the US base in West Germany, rather than combat in the jungle. Here they were nearly 4 years later in the village, and both the neighborhood and the world had gone through some significant changes. And throughout those changes, John Prine watched and contemplated and worked on his skills as a songwriter. So on this particular night, Chris's opener was Carly Simon, and he invited them afterwards to join him back to her place for a little gathering. At the time, Carly Simon was a little bit of an it girl. She was deep in the recording process of her second album, and anybody who was anybody was hanging out with Carly Simon. Kris had contributed a song to her new album, and of course, when he walked in the door, it was with the confidence of Kris Kristofferson. So Steve and John are hanging out, getting along just fine in the shadows, when all of a sudden there's a knock on the door. Bob Dylan had arrived, and this was nearing the end of his period of hiding that he was still in following his 1966 motorcycle accident. And it was extremely rare to see him out in public at this point, especially in the city. For years, he'd been living as a recluse in upstate New York, making music with his former touring group, The Band. And most recently, he'd done a famous collaboration with none other than Johnny Cash, the Nashville Skyline. Bob walked in like a vision in this room of celebrities. So of course, as the night progressed, the guitars came out, and it was time for John to share a song from his new album called Far From Me. As the cafe was closing. And it must have taken everything in him to not fall off his chair when Bob Dylan started to sing along to the song. Again, his album was not yet released. It was still in the production process, but Jerry Wexler, executive at Atlantic Records, who had been working with John, had sent Bob an early tape. So Bob Dylan is already a huge John Prine fan, even before his first album came out. And he would remain so indefinitely, describing Prine's work as Proustian existentialism, a blending of the memory-focused narrative style of Marcel Proust with the philosophically existential perspective on the human condition. A year later, when John was in the middle of carrying out his own residency at the Bitter End, Bob Dylan would show up and make a surprise appearance with John to perform a couple of songs as backup on harmonica. Most notably, his favorite at the time, a devastatingly critical story about a veteran who returns home from a conflict overseas plagued with both physical and mental wounds, both of which he self-medicates for. Unfortunately, in 1971, the Vietnam War was in no way finished. The conflict had spread from the borders of Vietnam into Cambodia and Laos, but the United States had begun to slowly reduce the number of soldiers they had in Southeast Asia from almost 350,000 in 1970 down to just 250,000 in 1971. And that year, the Army recognized that the drug problem within their ranks was getting so bad that the Department of Defense decided it was necessary to conduct a study, finding that over 50% of the armed forces use marijuana daily. Over 30% were regularly using psychedelics, and an additional 30% were using hard drugs like cocaine and heroin. On top of that, it was shown that 10% of the returning veterans were struggling with severe PTSD, which was a huge jump from the Second World War, where the figure was around 3%. These numbers were shocking to the American public, and further added fuel to the out-of-control protests against the draft and for the end of American involvement in Vietnam. John Prine had already served his time, and he He knew firsthand what it was like for a veteran to return home to a country ablaze with protest, expecting to be treated as a hero, and instead finding criticism and a lack of acknowledgement from the government. There were plenty of songs that criticized the American involvement in the Vietnam War, but very few spoke openly about the plight of the returning veteran and the reality of the mental and the physical health struggles that they would face upon returning home. But it was all around them, and John Prine felt great sympathy and outrage for his fellow vets.
This song I wrote a couple of years ago after I got out of the Army.
Sam Stone is a simple folk song with a tragic story at its core. A soldier returns home. He's wounded and addicted to morphine. His welcome home is less than he was expecting, and his PTSD from the war caused him to dive deeper into his addictions. He loses his wife, his family, the house that he bought on the GI Bill, and eventually succumbs to an overdose. And the chorus is particularly heartbreaking, as it acknowledges the children of these servicemen who would ultimately suffer the most from their parents' lack of availability, not only financially, but mentally and emotionally. There's a hole in Daddy's arm where all the money goes. The following line was somewhat controversial.
Jesus Christ died for nothing, I suppose.
So much so that when Johnny Cash, one of John's biggest idols and influences, chose to cover the song, he refused to sing the lyric.
Daddy must have heard a lot back then, I suppose. Little pictures have big ears.
He wanted to do Sam Stone when he first heard, when my first album came out. And Johnny was having trouble singing the part about Jesus Christ died for nothing, I suppose. And I said, well, you know, it's the heart of the song. For me, I said, it's everything in the song kind of fell out of that one line. And I said, I know where I'm coming from when I say that. It just means there's no hope. That like if the veteran's going to come home and be treated like that, and nobody's going to help him with his drug habit, then what's the use in living? I didn't want to change it myself, but I asked John if he wanted to say something about his father, and because it follows the line, "There's a hole in Daddy's arm where all the money goes." So John just came up with, "Daddy must have heard a lot back then, I suppose," and. I figured that's Johnny Cash. All I know is he's singing my song.
But trade his house that he bought on a GI Bill.
Rolling Stone magazine remarked that John's work was differently good when surrounded by a sea of up-and-coming singer-songwriters. These songs demanded thought and time from the listener. The thing about the way that John Prine wrote that got everybody's attention, then and now, was his ability to discuss uncomfortable subjects with clarity, empathy, and understanding without a shred of judgment. The album wasn't a massive hit. It peaked at number 55 on the Billboard charts, but it was a hit to those who worked within the music industry, and John Prine's first album would become a favorite among songwriters. Why his album didn't pop off the charts like Bob Dylan's had 10 years earlier is hard to say, and critics to this day are still theorizing why this might have happened. It was late 1971 when John's album was released, and the biggest songs on the radio were Maggie May by Rod Stewart, You've Got a Friend by James Taylor and Carole King, and Me and Bobby McGee, Kris Kristofferson, and Janis Joplin. Singer-songwriters reigned supreme, and it seemed to everybody involved that John's music was going to blow everybody away. And it did, but it remained in the underground. If I were to take a guess, I would break it down to this. John Prine is an album cover to cover of story songs. It's folk music in its truest form, not the evolved singer-songwriter state that the acoustic guitar had found itself in this era, but folk music. Woody Guthrie, Lead Belly style folk music. Stunning character studies of America's most marginalized people. And although his songs were practically perfect in the way that they were able to express the human condition, I think it was just a little bit too real for radio.